So the topic started to be fear, how fear gets in the way of practicing off the cushion. But how fear gets in the way doesn't really help us to resolve the problem. So it's kind of morphed into how to get fear out of the way so we can practice off the cushion. And I know from personal experience, it's not by sweeping fear under the carpet. So we'll look at fear actually through the lens of the Four Noble Truths, and then we'll look at some strategies or ways that you might get fear out of the way or learn to be with fear so that you can practice off the cushion. But what I'd like to start with is a poem by Valerie Burton called Strong. If strong means taking care of everyone else to the detriment of yourself, if strong means pretending everything is okay when you're clearly hurting, if strong means keeping it moving after you've suffered disappointment, then strong becomes weak. Strong is good, resilience is better. But resilience is messy. It may look as if you're down for the count. But as long as you eventually get up, you're resilient. You have permission then to be human, to grieve, rest, cry, and feel what you feel. Learning to face your fears by being vulnerable is the first step. And for me, that really is key, is learning to face your fears by being vulnerable. Is what you have to do if you want to make sure fear is not getting in the way of practicing off the cushion. Fear is our built-in alarm system, so we don't want to ignore it. We fear pain, we feel losing connections with loved ones, we fear not being good enough, we fear difficult conversations, we fear for our loved ones' safety and health. There's lots of fears. And those fears are a messenger to us. But the messenger is not necessarily always telling the whole truth. And sometimes those fears are fears that are covering up fears from our childhood. And we relate to them in ways that we did as a child. And basically that's because when fear happens, the alarm goes off in your brain's amygdala. And it triggers an automatic response. So we don't stop and pause and think before responding. We just jump on this hamster wheel of reactivity that I've lived a lot of my life on. And once you get that wheel going, it gets pretty hard to get off. And so today we're just looking at that unconscious driving force in our life that keeps us from living life to the fullest and keeps us from doing things that are really going to make us happy and sometimes encourages us to do things that aren't really going to make us happy or make anybody else happy either. So we need to face our fear. If we want to face our fears, we need to be vulnerable. And we all don't like the idea of being vulnerable. Because vulnerability doesn't feel good. We see it as a strength in other people. When we see them being vulnerable, we think, oh, wow. But when we think about vulnerability in ourselves, we think about it as a weakness, that we're bad because we're feeling vulnerable, or it's a feeling we're not supposed to have, so we want to push it away. But to face our fears, we need to be vulnerable. Tara Brach says, vulnerability is the portal to opening and awakening, the portal to freedom. So let's take a look at vulnerability through the lens of the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth, vulnerability is universal. There is anxiety in everyone's nervous system. The second noble truth, we perceive ourselves as a separate self. Therefore, I'm doomed and I have to tense against what's going to happen. The third noble truth: it is possible to live with an undefended heart. And the fourth noble truth: we can respond to our vulnerability with a loving presence. And we'll spend most of our time talking about that. But let's look at the first noble truth. Vulnerability is universal. We all experience fear, isolation, vulnerability. Is there anyone in this room who's never had that feeling? So look around. You're in really good company. It's universal. We're not alone. The second noble truth: we perceive ourselves as separate. Therefore, we're doomed, and we have to tense against what's going to go wrong. Perceiving ourselves as separate from everyone means that we have to worry about an us versus them, and am I going to get enough if they're out there getting that? And so we feel the need to put up our defenses. And some of our defenses we created when we were quite young. And we think that our defenses protect us. But if this avoidance strategy worked, then the Buddha wouldn't have needed to teach anything at all, because our natural reactions would automatically bring security, happiness, and comfort. But the Buddha did not see that at all. That's not what he observed. He saw that our efforts to try to find zones of safety weaken us, that they make the world more terrifying, and they put us on the hamster wheel of reactivity. The fear of vulnerability hooks us, and we get stuck. We get on that hamster wheel, and we can't figure out how to get off. Sometimes we even know that we're on the hamster wheel and that we're saying things that are not skillful, and we can't stop because we're hooked. And we might feel a tightening or a tension in our body. We feel ourselves maybe closing down, but we're stuck. We're not able to relax or open because we've got that fear of vulnerability. It's already hooked us. So we don't want to be where we are, and so we get on that hamster wheel trying to get away from where we are, and it doesn't really work. So fear of rejection has been my biggest fear in my life. I'm always worried that people might think I'm not good enough. And it all stems from when I was in 7th grade. I had this awful secret from 7th grade that I've only told 2 people in 50 years. Recently, I've told more people. And that awful secret was that when I was in 7th grade, my best friend told me I didn't fit in with the group anymore, and she didn't want to hang around with me. And I went home crying, and my sister saw me as I was walking into the house, and I told her what happened, and she said, "Run upstairs and wash your face so Mom doesn't see you're crying." So I did, and that gave me the message that, oh, this is a bad thing. There must be something wrong with you that this happened. And so what happened was I felt shame, and when we feel shame, we hide things. So for 50 years, I only told 2 people that story. And that allows shame to grow. When shame is in the dark and in silence, it grows. When shame is talked about and we shine the light of mindfulness on it, shame shrinks. And so for many years, I was like, oh, people aren't going to like me because of this. And I thought that it was the most awful thing. I didn't want to tell anyone this story. I kept it in silence. So the fear of rejection caused me to put defenses up, and those defenses were closing up when I met people. And the more I closed up when I met people, the less they were likely to reach out to me because I was closed up. So our defenses that we think are going to keep us safe really backfire on us a lot of the time. And so it's important to really know and understand the defenses that we have. We think we protect ourselves when we hide our vulnerability. I thought I was protecting myself all those years, not opening myself to risk and hurt, not getting too close to anyone because they might reject me. But doing that closed me off to love, to joy, to friendships. For 50 years, that's a lot of years. It's scary to open ourselves to the life that's here because it might not turn out the way we want. And we sometimes don't think we're strong enough to handle whatever it's going to be. So we cover our vulnerability with layer after layer after layer of armor to keep ourselves protected. My layers of armor were being a know-it-all because getting good grades got me approval and doing everything for everyone. And that worked real well early in my career, but it backfires a lot because being a know-it-all and doing everything for everyone kind of makes the people around you feel stupid and useless. So, how's that for wanting to build up myself? So, we want to avoid the feeling of fear, so we build up these barriers and these defenses. I was so busy, I didn't have time for friends, especially not when my kids were young. So I closed myself off from experiences where the fear might arise. And I deluded myself into thinking that it was going to keep me safe. We always try to control the uncontrollable by looking for security and predictability. I know if I do this, this will happen. I know that if I do this, I'll be safe. But the truth is we can never avoid uncertainty. This not knowing is really part of the adventure of life. And it's also what makes us afraid. So we need to learn to be with our fear. And that's really the third noble truth. It is possible to live with an undefended heart. Pema Chodron says that we often act like timid birds who don't dare leave the nest. We sit in a nest that's getting pretty smelly and hasn't served its function for a very long time. No one's arriving to feed us. No one's protecting us and keeping us warm. And yet we keep hoping Mother Bird will arrive. We could do ourselves the ultimate favor and finally get out of the nest. That this takes courage is obvious. That we could use some helpful hints is also clear. And that's what we'll be talking about in this Dharma talk, is some helpful hints. Because I sat in that nest since 1968. And looking deeply at the experience and holding myself with compassion, I finally realized that that rejection did not mean I was flawed. Because I thought I was flawed. I thought I was the only one in the world who was rejected. Crazy, I know, but initially that's really what I thought. When I finally told some friends the story of my rejection, they didn't reject me, they were very compassionate. And they were, it's just amazing how shining the light of awareness on our shame reduces its power over us. And that's so important, that giving voice to our shame and shining the light reduces its power over us. I was not the only one who was rejected. As a matter of fact, I found out my sister had a similar story. She was in 6th grade, I was in 7th, and neither of us knew about it until just about 3 weeks ago. So I learned that I was not flawed. I was just human. And I was not the only one. That was just part of being human, is being rejected, finding your place in the world. So this gives me, this clear seeing, really looking at it, gives me the courage, I'm not going to say to live with an undefended heart, but I'll say a less defended heart. Letting ourselves feel emotions is one of the most courageous things we can do. It's vulnerable even to feel joy, because that could get snatched away from us. Pema Chodron says, emotions won't kill you, but not feeling them will. Our fear of emotion can absolutely kill us. Pain won't kill us, but numbing pain kills people every single day. We are the most obese, in debt, medicated, workaholic, addicted adults in human history. Pain won't kill you, but numbing pain kills people every minute of every day. And it's amazing the feeling of freedom that you get when you can be with your fear and be with your vulnerability and stop using your energy to appear in a certain way and just let your naturalness be there. I have this theory that introverted people are so exhausted when they go out into a big group because they've got so many defenses up in filters that things have to go through that they exhaust themselves. They don't let their naturalness just be there. It takes a lot of energy to keep up your mask, and that energy could be better used being present for ourselves and being present for others. It would allow us to feel the peace of just being in the present moment. I've lived a lot of my life not in the present moment. It also opens us up to others, thus fulfilling our need for belonging that's underneath that fear of rejection. So we want to have an undefended heart, but we need a wise relationship with vulnerability. I learned this from my teachers at Tachita, that you can't just be vulnerable with anyone. It's a very dangerous thing to do. But we don't want to put ourselves down when we get defensive, saying, oh, I shouldn't be defensive. Because that defensiveness made sense at some stage of our development. And those defenses worked at some stage, and that's why they became a habit. The problem is that what worked for me in 7th grade might not work so well at 63. So I have to look at my defenses and say what's really working and what's not working. And I can also look and say, you know what? Being defended isn't really being safe. Because I still have that fear that if I wasn't defended, I would be in trouble. You know, if I wasn't defended, people wouldn't like me. I still have that fear. It's what we resist persists. So when we defend ourselves, we're resisting. And that's going to stay. And so you have to keep pushing it down, and that takes a lot of energy. So the fourth noble truth, we can respond to our vulnerability with a loving presence. It's hard to take off our armor because then you're left in a very uncomfortable place. Pema Chodron says, you've been doing the same predictable thing to get away from that uneasy, uncomfortable, vulnerable feeling for so long, and now you're not. So you're left with that queasy feeling. This requires some getting used to. I'm still working on that. And some ability to practice kindness and patience. It requires some openness and curiosity to see what happens next. What happens when you don't fuel the discomfort with the storyline? What happens when you abide with this shifting, fluid, universal energy? What happens if you pause and embrace the natural movement of life? So we all need some hints to be with our vulnerability and to have an undefended heart. So I had to start at ground zero. Many of you maybe already know how to be with discomfort, but my first step was increasing my tolerance for discomfort. The first 50-plus years of my life, I spent brushing anything unpleasant under the carpet. My mother was the queen of denial, and I was the princess. When I first started meditating, I thought, sitting through discomfort, that's just plain stupid. I'm not going to do that. If I have an itch, I'm going to scratch it. If I'm uncomfortable, I'm going to move. And it took a lot of years of regular sitting and listening to Dharma talks and getting advice from my SnowFlower brothers and sisters till I finally realized that I don't have to give in to the urge to scratch the itch right when it comes up. And I finally thought, okay, I'm going to try it. I'll let an itch be there. And what I found out was the itch arose, it was there for a while, and it went away without me doing anything. I could be with it. So I did that for a while, and then I started with, the small pains you get. Can I sit with that? And they arose. They were there for a while. Sometimes that while was the rest of the sit. Sometimes it wasn't. But I could be with them. So I was learning that I can be with discomfort. I don't have to run away every time there's a discomfort. And for me, that's the foundation of being with fear and vulnerability, is not pushing it away, but just learning to be with it. And so here's a couple of strategies in no particular order that I've been trying out to learn to be with my fear and my vulnerability so that I can practice in everyday life off the cushion. And the first one is just practicing vulnerability. Be aware when the fear's in you. So if I want to ask someone to coffee, I feel the fear that comes up. And I say, okay, I can be with this. And I can send that email or text or pick up that phone. Just feeling the vulnerability helps you to be less identified with it. Because when we're in the middle of an interaction, we can't stop and feel the vulnerability and decide what to do with it. But we can practice outside. So throughout the day, I'll stop and say, is there some vulnerability in me? Do I feel a tensing, a tightness, a knot? What am I feeling in my body? What's really going on inside? And then, can I just be with this for just a minute? I don't have to be with it an hour. Just a minute. Or maybe longer. And by doing that, I learn to stop and pause so that I'm not automatically jumping on the hamster wheel of reactivity and using the defenses that I know don't work. So you're bringing a gentle, curious attention. Oh, I'm feeling vulnerable about this. And you might name it fear, vulnerability. And know that the feeling doesn't stay forever. If you sit with it, it does go away. And the next time it comes up, you can say, oh, fear, here you are again. I know you. I recognize you. And recognizing fear is very important, and that brings me to the next strategy, which is learn what vulnerability feels like in your body. When I first started teacher training, one of the first things Jonathan Faust said is, the issues are in your tissues. And I thought, oh, that's too woo-woo for me. But it's really, really true. The issues are in your tissues. And if you can feel what vulnerability feels like in your body, you get a 1-second head start on pausing and responding instead of jumping on the hamster wheel. So you might want to do some reflection at some point to think about how you feel when you're vulnerable and what it really feels like in your body. Is it in your chest? Is it in your belly? Mine is in my hands. Wonder why I got arthritis in my hands. Because I tense them up. So think about it so that you know where that vulnerability comes up in your body. Because your body senses the vulnerability and you feel the sensation before your brain has the opportunity to click in and realize what's going on. And so it gives you the head start to say, oh, vulnerability. I'm going to pause. Instead of, oh, I'm uncomfortable. I'm jumping on the hamster wheel. Third one is practicing on the cushion. We have to practice on the cushion to be able to practice off the cushion. We can't stop our habit energies in the midst of fear if we haven't practiced. So the best place to practice is on the cushion, to practice what you can do off the cushion. Pema Chodron says, sitting practice teaches us how to open and relax to whatever arises without picking and choosing. It teaches us to experience the uneasiness and the urge fully and to interrupt the momentum that usually follows. We do this by not following after the thoughts and learning to come back to the present moment. We learn to stay with the uneasiness, the tightness, the itch of Shepna. Shepna is an urge, a hook, or a trigger. We train in sitting still with our desire to scratch. This is how we learn to stop the chain reaction of habitual patterns that will otherwise rule our lives. This is how we weaken the patterns that keep us hooked into discomfort that we mistake as comfort. So instead of beating ourselves up when we get hooked on vulnerability, there's something else we can do. We can sit on the meditation cushion and we can rerun that story without getting hooked in the content. Most important piece is without getting hooked in the content. And we can look at that and say, what's underneath this? Is there grasping? Is there aversion? Is there desire? What's underneath this vulnerability? And we can give ourselves the intention that we're not going to run away from fear and vulnerability, but we're going to just practice being with it without reacting or responding, without acting on the vulnerability. So we can do that on the meditation cushion, which is going to make it easier to do that in life the next time vulnerability comes up. Another practice is to recognize our habitual ways of moving away from vulnerability. And there's three of probably most common ways are being busy, chronic judging, and putting on a mask. Anybody not use any of those three? We all use them. Being busy, we're always on our way somewhere. We have a job to do. We're tumbling into the next moment. Ty says our blocks of pain, sorrow, anger, and despair always want to come up into our mind consciousness, into our living room, because they've grown big and they need attention. They want to emerge, but we don't want these uninvited guests to come up because they're painful to look at. So we try to block their way. We want them to stay asleep down the basement. We don't want to face them, so our habit is to fill the living room with other guests. Whenever we have 10 or 15 minutes of free time, we do anything we can to keep our living room occupied. We hope that if the living room is occupied, these unpleasant mental formations will not come up. I know my living room has been very occupied in my life. Always have something to do. And the other one, chronic judging. That covers up the deep fear that I'll never get what I want, or be the person I want, or simply mine is that I'm just not good enough. And the chronic judging, we try and elevate ourselves by putting others down. And even when we're judging ourselves, it makes us feel more powerful and strong because we're judging. But the problem is judging suppresses our natural curiosity. So we see part of the picture, but not all of the picture. It keeps us separate, and as the Second Noble Truth said, when we're separate, we're doomed, and we have to tense against what's going to go wrong. Father Greg Boyle of Homeboy Industry says, if you don't tend to your own brokenness, you will be tempted to be judgmental about the brokenness of others. And the third habitual way is putting on a mask to get approval. We lock into a persona. I was the know-it-all. I was the go-to person at work. I was the mom who would do anything for her kids. I had this persona that I had to keep up all the time. You might have a persona of being the helper or the controller or the boss or the clown or all sorts of other personas, and it takes a lot of energy to keep that mask up, energy that we're not using to be in the present moment. Another one is one from Thai, which is invite your fear to tea. Invite your fear into consciousness and smile through it. Every time you smile through your fear, it will lose some of its strength. If you try to run away from your pain, there's no way out. Only by looking deeply into the nature of your fear can you find the way out. So you want to recognize the presence of fear. Learn to hold it lightly instead of sweeping it under the carpet or pushing it away. Tai says, hello, my fear. I know you're there. I'm going to take good care of you. And every time the fear manifests, we have to let it manifest. And then look deeply into the nature of that fear. And the more we practice, the more gentle we can be with our fear. We can let our knots circulate up into our living room. And the final strategy is taking refuge in the Sangha. This has really been important to me. Our practice helps transform our suffering, but I can't tell you how many times I look at some of my sisters who are not mindful, but appear to be happy and think, why the heck did I ever start this practice? It's really hard. And if it weren't for Sangha, I don't know that I would have continued the practice. We have brothers and sisters that inspire us, motivate us. Listening to Dharma talks, we find out we're not alone. We're not the only one with these quirky problems. Other people have it. And we learn a lot. Tai says group energy is stronger than our individual energy by itself. And if you know how to borrow from it, you'll be strong enough to hold your feelings and not be overwhelmed by suffering. That's why our Sangha is so important. Sangha gave me the courage to look at being with discomfort and begin looking deeply at myself and my defenses. And by looking deeply, I learned to open to the life that's here instead of tensing against what might happen, at least some of the time. So my wish for you is may you have the courage to show up and be vulnerable and let yourself be open.